All right. So this is the short version of the solar farm discussion about land use. So one of the big concerns that many people have with solar farms, these larger scale solar power installations, is the amount of land that's used by them, particularly if it involves leasing agriculture land. Previously you used farmland for putting the solar farms. There seems to be a very, in many cases, very, very dedicated attachment to that land, even by people who don't own that land. And generally these conflicts arise by people who don't own the land, and some landowner is going to lease out his land for a solar farm. And the people in the surrounding community are just not happy about it for a variety of reasons. But one of the things is there's a lot of concern that we are consuming the land. That we are basically rendering our agriculture cropland unusable, and we are not going to have enough land to grow food. We're not going to have enough land to produce fiber and animals and livestock because we're putting solar farms there. Well, we have to think about this. It's very easy to get into this mindset of a traditional kind of idea of what a rural area should be. At the end of the day, technological changes are inevitable, and solar power is a technological change that has an enormous force behind it because it's very cheap to produce electricity using solar farms. It's very economical. It doesn't require fuel input. It doesn't require water usage. It's quiet. It doesn't have moving parts. It's very low maintenance. So it's a really good technology for producing electricity. But it builds on the surface of the land, and surface area is the name of the game here. So we have to collect the sunlight over a surface area. So we build what's called a solar farm, which is just a piece of land where we set up rows. Usually they're rows of solar panels called arrays. And the arrays then have the panels, and they collect the sunlight and they convert it directly into electricity. And the thing that's really amazing about solar power is when you go by one of these solar farms, you think that nothing's happening. You can't really see any activity. You can't really see that there's millions of watts being produced. You could have a solar farm generating enough electricity for thousands of homes, and you don't even notice it. It's not like a coal-fired power plant where you see plumes of steam coming off, or you see emissions, or you see trains moving around, or you see piles of coal outside with people driving equipment on those. It's very, very different. It's just like, it almost looks like it's not doing anything, but yet it most certainly is. So solar power is the cheapest way to generate electricity. Even if you take all the tax cuts out of it, in the United States there's a tax credit that anybody who owns a solar farm can claim a 30% tax credit. What that means is that they have to be making money. So in order to claim a tax credit, you have to have taxable income. So you have to be making money. So the idea that these are just these, virtue signaling government-funded installations that sit and do nothing is internet, falsehood. Because the only way that they can claim those tax credits is to actually be producing electricity and selling it and creating a taxable income and getting money that they can apply to their taxes, and then have that deduct the tax credit off of that. So that's the story there. So these are actual working pieces of equipment that are generating electricity. They choose farmland first because it's just the easiest. You have to have access to transmission lines. You have to have access to roads. And you have to have land that's, you don't have to have it, but it's ideal to have land that's nice and flat and easy to work with. Yeah, agriculture land is really good for that. So developers will go around to farm kind of lands and they'll say, hey, we want to build this. We want to lease your land for this, amount of money per acre per year. Will you sign a lease? It's just like oil and gas, except instead of drilling wells and sucking the chemicals out of the ground in order to produce energy, we're taking light from the sky and doing the same thing, converting it into a product that can be sold and used, and people use it, for their everyday enjoyment. So the map that I have up here is kind of a depiction of all the land uses in the United States. agriculture is a very, very large amount of land use. We have idle and fallow land up here where Michigan is. We've got food we eat. So this is all the vegetable crops that we eat, the grains and things like that. We've got livestock feed down here, both domestic and import or export livestock feed. So we're a net agricultural exporter, so this is all just exports. But basically we dedicate this area to growing the crops to feed animals, and then all this area here is the pasture for the animals. Cattle is an enormous fraction of the land use, ranches and things like that. So that's all set aside for animals. Then we've got timberland, forests for producing wood products over here. A very large amount of land also. The northeast here is effectively set aside, and we have urban housing, rural housing, and commercial real estate right here. So even though we think cities are these enormous sprawling, consumers of land, really in the grand scheme of things, they're not that big compared with everything else that's here. We've got our national parks, our state parks, our federal wilderness land, and then we've got highways. We've got private landowners that they've set aside kind of the size of Florida. Some more private land up here. So agriculture effectively is cropland, I should say. So plant-based agriculture. So growing things is this set of categories right here. You can see it kind of takes out, they put it in kind of the Midwest up, all the way up to the bottom to the top, from the bottom to the top there. So we have 52 million acres of idle/fallow land that's not being actively used for growing crops. We have 38 million acres set aside for biodiesel and ethanol, for fuel, energy, just like we're talking about with solar farms, but it's the form of ethanol and biodiesel, liquid fuel. Food we eat, 77 million acres. Livestock feed, 127 million acres. Exported products, basically here's around 80 million acres. Cotton and non-food fiber is 13.6 million acres. Things that would fit into the non-food category that are plant products. So, interesting, the conflict seems to be that we're going to cover all of our agricultural cropland with solar panels, and we're going to enter a dark age of famine and destruction and starvation because of this. All right. If we were to generate all of the electricity, I'm talking take every source of electricity that we have now, coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydropower, wind, and convert it all to solar, and just megawatt hours per year, this is how much land would be needed to generate that amount of electricity. 12 million acres. All right. It's not really that big because 52 million acres is fallow land. 38 million acres is for ethanol and biodiesel. We actually need a third of the land to generate all of the electricity we currently use for ethanol and biodiesel. And ethanol and biodiesel is a tiny fraction of the energy consumption in the United States. It's quite small. Here, we would be taking like electricity, which is like a fourth of our energy consumption, and using only a third of the land we use for ethanol and biodiesel. Because electricity, especially solar panels, is much more efficient than creating liquid fuel out of crops. Plants just aren't that good at converting sunlight into chemical energy. A solar panel is 5 to 10 times better than a plant at converting light into electricity. Photosynthesis, despite it being natural and around for millions and millions and millions of years, still isn't that efficient. A solar panel is much better. So that's why you can get a lot more energy per acre out of solar panels than you can get out of growing crops. But, electricity is only part of the, energy that we use. We have all the energy that goes into automobiles, into trucks, into industry for heating, into heating your homes if you use like natural gas to heat your house. All that energy is separate from electricity. So I did try to do a conservative calculation on how much energy would be required. So if we subtract out the electricity, or the energy that we're currently using to produce electricity, and we have that 12 million acres, and then we add land to produce the equivalent amount of energy that we use for all those aforementioned, like transportation and things like that, I'm just basically saying 61 million acres. That's enough solar panels to produce 75 quads, which is a quadrillion BTU, the funky unit that the Energy Information Administration likes to use, would be needed to produce all of the energy that we currently use in the country. And this is what I consider this to be a conservative estimate. It probably, if you were to do it, properly, assuming that we electrify heating and a lot of transportation, the number would shrink even more. We wouldn't need this much energy because fossil fuel, like internal combustion engines, are not very efficient. They get like 20% of the. So if you buy a gallon of gasoline, for every dollar you spend on a gallon of gasoline, only 20 cents of that dollar spins the wheels of your car and makes it go. The other 80 cents goes out the exhaust and it goes out the radiator as heat. That's just lost. Electric cars are 3 or 4 times better than that. So electric car might be 80 to 90% efficient. So for every dollar you spend on electricity in your electric car, 80 to 90 cents of that is spinning the wheels, and only 10 to 20 cents of it is going out as heat. So if we were to use electrified transportation, we could shrink that consumption value even more and make this area less. But let's just keep it the way it is, just to be conservative here. We have 77 million acres is the food we eat, and then we have 127 million acres just in this category here. We actually need less land for solar farms than we do for food, much less than food, and then almost just slightly over what we have as idle and fallow land. So land that's not being used for anything, an agricultural land, that what we call prime farmland, the kind of thing that people are trying to get banned from solar farms being built on, is just idle land that if it had this, we would be able to produce all of the energy that we need. The ethanol and biodiesel as well. Get rid of the 38 million acres we use for ethanol and biodiesel, convert it to solar farms. You're halfway there to producing all of the energy that we need. So, the idea that we're consuming all of the land and we're not going to have enough land for growing food is not a concern that I have, and I don't think anybody else should have. And we're certainly not going to build a solar farm that all fits in one little area. They would be distributed across the entire country, and a lot of this area would be on buildings, it'd be on parking lots, it'd be on landfills, it'd be on possibly bodies of water, land that you can't really use for anything else. So just because we're going after the easy stuff first, the cropland or the idle fallow land or the ethanol biodiesel corn land, doesn't mean that it all will end up there. And it doesn't mean that we're going to just gobble this farmland up and we're not going to be able to grow crops, right? That's the idea here. So one thing that's kind of an aside to this conversation about solar farms is the amount of land that we set aside for making livestock feed. 127 million acres here for domestic livestock feed. That is double the amount of land that we would need to produce all of the energy from solar farms. Quite impressive, right? So when somebody talks about being vegetarian, and it sounds weird and it sounds bizarre, like it doesn't matter, and really we use a lot of land and a lot of fertilizer and a lot of pesticides to produce food for animals. More so than we do for producing vegetable food for ourselves. So there is something to being vegetarian, just put it that way, when it comes to land use. But the other thing with this area here is I'm making, well, actually both of these areas, I'm making the assumption we're converting all the electricity generation to solar. We wouldn't do that. We have wind power, nuclear power, hydropower that wouldn't be converted to solar power. There's no reason to convert those. So if we just instead said we're going to convert only the coal and the natural gas fired power plants to solar, this would be 7 million acres instead of 12 million acres, and it would shrink even more. This would shrink even more. So that's the kind of scale that you need for land in order to produce energy. It is not the gigantic, end all, we're going to blanket the entire nation with solar panels thing. We have solar farms being proposed in Michigan. People think that this stuff only works in California or Arizona. No, the reality of it is it's best to put the solar farm near where the electricity is being consumed. So we have solar farms going in Michigan, which has some of the lowest solar radiation in the entire United States. But yet, developers are able to make money there. It still works. People think that it doesn't work. Oh, solar doesn't work. It either works or it doesn't work. Well, that's not really how it goes. You produce less per acre in Michigan than you would in Arizona, but you still are able to make money, and you're still able to get a return on investment from your equipment, because the equipment is cheap to install and it's cheap to operate. So that's why solar is such a good energy source. The only downside of it is the variability associated with the weather and the daily night and day cycle. Things like, say, nuclear power works really good where the weather dependency comes in. Doesn't really care what the weather is outside, but it's very expensive to build, almost uneconomical to build. But it's pretty cheap to operate once it's up and running. And then you got natural gas, which is cheap to build, but it's very expensive to operate. So you have to buy fuel. So if you can build natural gas and not really run it that much, then you can use that capacity to offset the variability from solar. And then your carbon dioxide emissions are greatly reduced and your fuel consumption is lower, but you're still able to produce electricity to meet demand. The one thing about the traditional power plants in the U.S., so the coal and the natural gas and the hydro plants, even though we think that those energy sources are always producing, the reality of it is most electricity generating facilities are idle more than they are actually running. So we have about a terawatt or a trillion watts or 1,000 gigawatts of electricity generation in the United States, but our average load is only about 400 or 500 megawatts. The only time that those extra plants come into play is when it gets either really hot outside or really cold outside. Otherwise, they're just idle. So solar farms, just because it gets dark at night and you're not producing anything at night, doesn't mean it's not economical. You don't have to pay for fuel, so it really makes a lot of sense. So that's why we're seeing all this stuff happen, why we're seeing a 1,300 megawatt solar farm in Indiana. We're seeing hundreds of megawatts of solar farms in Pennsylvania and Virginia, states that you normally wouldn't associate with solar energy. So that's the story. The land use, I just don't worry about it. It doesn't get me concerned about whether there's going to be enough land or whether we're properly using land at all, just because of these kind of values that you see right here. And that's it.